I learned something that night that took me years to understand sometimes. The room decides who you are before you ever speak. An engagement party is supposed to celebrate love, success, and family. But as I stood there with a glass of water I never finished, I could feel the quiet verdict being passed on me by smiles that lingered too long, by laughter that wasn't meant to include me. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. I had learned long ago that explaining only made people listen less. They thought they knew my worth. They thought they knew my limits. And they were comfortable mocking what they believed I would never become. What they didn't know was that truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in late dressed, simply carrying authority without announcing it. Sometimes justice doesn't interrupt the insults right away. Sometimes it waits until everyone is watching. And when that stranger spoke and said my name first, the room changed forever. Before we continue, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And if stories about quiet endurance and overdue justice resonate with you, consider subscribing. You're not alone here. I didn't walk into that engagement party as an outsider. I walked in as someone everyone thought they already understood. In my family, labels were assigned early and never revised. My sibling was the achiever. The one with straight A's, the confident smile in school photos, the teacher recommendations that sounded like letters of prophecy. I was the reliable one. The child who didn't cause problems, didn't ask for much, and didn't demand attention. Adults praised me for being easy. No one noticed how quickly easy became invisible. We grew up in the Midwest in a house where success was measured loudly for some and quietly ignored for others. When my sibling won awards, the living room filled with applause and camera flashes. When I worked after school to help cover my own expenses, it was treated as expected, not exceptional. Responsibility was assumed to be my natural state, not something worth celebrating. By the time we reached adulthood, the contrast had hardened into a permanent narrative. My sibling went straight to a prestigious university, the kind people mentioned with a slight lift in their voice. I took a different path, community college first, then transferring once I could afford it without loans that would follow me for decades. I worked while studying, sometimes sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night. My grades were good, but no one asked about them. There were no banners, no graduation party big enough to remember. After college, the pattern continued. My sibling landed a position at a well-known firm, the type with glossy recruitment brochures and networking events at rooftop bars. I took a job that paid modestly but steadily, in a field that required confidentiality, patience, and an ability to stay calm when others panicked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't something you bragged about at parties. But it mattered. Still, in family conversations, it barely existed. At holidays, relatives would ask my sibling about bonuses, promotions, travel. When they turned to me, the questions softened as if I might break under anything too specific. "So, you're still doing that same thing," they'd say, nodding sympathetically. I learned to answer in short sentences. Anything longer invited comparisons I could never win. Over time, I stopped trying. So when the engagement invitation arrived thick and formal, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. The card was elegant, the wording precise, as if designed to impress before the event even began. My name was printed, not handwritten. No note, no message, just an expectation. I considered declining. I imagined the relief of not standing in another room where my worth would be silently tallied and found lacking. But I also knew what my absence would mean. It would become another data point in the unspoken case against me. They didn't even show up. Always distant, never fully part of the family. So I said yes. The day of the party, I drove alone. I arrived early not because I wanted to help, but because being late felt like another failure waiting to be interpreted. The venue was expensive in a quiet way, glass walls, soft lighting staff who spoke in low voices and never rushed. Everything about the space communicated status without needing to announce it. I stood in the parking lot for a moment before going inside, adjusting my jacket, taking a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I wasn't nervous about the event itself. I was tired of the role I was expected to play. Inside, the room buzzed with conversation. Laughter rose and fell in practiced rhythms. Groups formed naturally, people leaning in toward each other, sharing stories that assumed shared definitions of success. I recognized the posture immediately. It was the posture of people who believed they belonged exactly where they were. I took a glass of water instead of champagne and positioned myself near the edge of the room. From there, I could see everything without being seen. My sibling was surrounded by guests telling a story with animated gestures. Their fiancé stood close, hand resting confidently at their side, smiling at all the right moments. When my sibling finally noticed me, it was with a brief flicker of surprise, quickly masked by politeness. "Oh, you're here," they said, as if they hadn't expected me to follow through. "Drinks are over there." That was it. No introduction, no inclusion, just a direction. I nodded and stayed where I was. As the evening unfolded, I heard my name a few times, always followed by pauses. People asked about me indirectly, like I was a topic too dull to address head-on. When my sibling answered, their tone was light, dismissive, without being openly cruel. "They're doing fine," they'd say. "Nothing too exciting, but stable." Stable. The word landed the same way it always did, like a compliment designed to end the conversation. I noticed the small things others missed. The way someone smirked after hearing that description. The way another guest raised their eyebrows slightly, already losing interest. These weren't dramatic gestures. They were subtle, efficient, enough to place me firmly where they thought I belonged. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct anyone. I stood quietly listening to people talk about investments, travel plans, and future ambitions. No one asked about mine. No one wondered why I seemed unbothered. What they couldn't see was how familiar this was to me. I had spent years learning how to exist in rooms where my value was underestimated. I knew how to stand without shrinking and how to stay silent without disappearing entirely. Silence for me wasn't weakness. It was survival. Still, there was a moment, brief, sharp, when I felt the urge to leave. To walk out before the speeches, before the toasts, before another joke found me standing just close enough to hear it. I imagined the quiet of my car, the relief of distance, but I stayed. Not because I owed anyone my presence, but because I wanted for once to see the night through. I wanted to know how much more they would assume before reality intervened. At that point, no one in the room had any reason to question their conclusions. To them, I was exactly who I appeared to be, the less impressive sibling, the quiet one, the afterthought. They didn't know what I had done to build my life. They didn't know who I worked with, or who trusted me, or why discretion had become my greatest asset. They didn't know that silence had taught me how to listen, and listening had taught me far more than speaking ever could. Most importantly, they didn't know that everything they believed about me was about to be challenged, not by me, but by someone they would be forced to respect. And as I stood there unnoticed, holding a glass of water and watching the room move without me, I had no idea that the moment that would change everything was already walking toward the door. The longer the night went on, the more the engagement party revealed itself not as a celebration but as a performance. Once the initial greetings were over, the room settled into clusters. People gravitated toward whoever carried the most visible markers of success. Job titles were exchanged the way business cards used to be, each one weighed carefully before the conversation continued or quietly drifted away. Laughter came easily to those who felt secure in their place. For everyone else, it was practiced. I stayed near the edge of the room, close enough to hear but far enough to remain optional. It was a position I knew well. From there, I watched my sibling and their fiancé work the crowd like seasoned hosts. They moved with confidence, hands resting lightly on shoulders, voices warm and rehearsed. This was their moment, and everyone knew it. At one point, a group gathered near the high-top table beside me. I didn't join them, but I didn't move away either. Their conversation was loud enough that pretending not to hear would have been dishonest. "So what do you do?" A man in a tailored suit asked my sibling's fiancé, clearly enjoying the exchange. They answered smoothly, listing a role that came with an impressive salary range and a company name people recognized. The man nodded approvingly. "Smart move," he said. "That kind of position opens doors." Someone else chimed in asking about future plans, relocation, leadership tracks, long-term incentives. The questions flowed easily, like everyone already agreed this was a life worth investing in. Then the conversation shifted. "And what about your partner's sibling?" the same man asked, glancing around. "Are they here tonight?" There was a pause. A short one, but noticeable. My sibling smiled, the kind of smile that softened the edges of what came next. "Yeah, they're around," they said. "They're quieter. Work's a steady job. Nothing flashy." The word flashy hung in the air, heavy with implication. "Oh," the man replied, his interest visibly dimming. "Well, someone has to do the boring stuff, right?" A few people laughed. Not loudly, not maliciously. Just enough to acknowledge the joke and move on. No one looked at me directly, but I felt the comment land all the same. It wasn't meant to hurt. That was almost worse. It was meant to categorize and dismiss efficiently and without guilt. I took a slow sip of my water and reminded myself to breathe. Moments later, another guest, a woman wearing a bracelet that probably cost more than my monthly rent, leaned closer to my sibling. "You must be relieved," she said quietly, though not quietly enough. "At least one of you really made it." This time the laughter was sharper. I didn't flinch. Years ago I might have. I might have forced a smile or made a self-deprecating comment to ease the tension. But I had learned that participating in your own minimization doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes it easier for others to continue. So I stayed silent. As the night progressed, the comments grew bolder. People grew more comfortable. Alcohol loosened filters and assumptions turned into statements. Someone asked me directly, finally acknowledging my presence. "So," they said, looking me over with casual curiosity, "are you planning to follow in your siblings' footsteps at some point?" The question was framed as encouragement. But the implication was clear: I was behind. "I'm doing what I need to be doing," I replied simply. They nodded, unconvinced. "Well, that's important too," they said, in the same tone people use when talking to someone who has settled for less. Nearby, my sibling overheard and laughed lightly. "They've always been content," they added. "Low stress. Simple life. Simple." Another word that sounded kind until you heard it enough times to understand what it really meant. I noticed my parents watching from across the room. They didn't intervene. They didn't correct anyone. Their expressions were neutral, almost relieved, as if the narrative unfolding matched what they had already accepted years ago. That hurt more than the jokes. There was a moment when someone raised a glass and made an offhand toast. "To ambition," they said, "and to knowing your place." More laughter, more clinking of glasses. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, not exactly. Something closer to grief. Grief for the version of myself I used to believe might one day be seen differently by the people who raised me. Grief for the realization that to them my quiet endurance had always been mistaken for a lack of achievement. I thought about all the nights I had worked late, all the responsibilities I had carried without recognition, the confidentiality agreements I had signed, the trust placed in me by people who never would have laughed at me the way these guests were doing now. None of that mattered here. In this room, value was performative. If you couldn't summarize your worth in a sentence that impressed strangers, you were invisible at best and a punchline at worst. At one point, my siblings stepped closer to me, lowering their voice just enough to appear considerate. "You okay?" they asked, though their eyes scanned the room behind me. "I'm fine," I said. They hesitated, then smiled. "You know how these things are. Don't take it personally." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I was done trying to be understood by someone who had never really tried to understand me. As speeches were announced and guests began to gather, I considered stepping outside. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, with unspoken hierarchies. I could feel the familiar exhaustion settling in, the kind that comes not from being insulted once, but from being diminished repeatedly, quietly over time. Still, I stayed. I stood there, hands relaxed at my sides, face neutral. I didn't interrupt the speeches. I didn't react when another joke landed too close. I didn't correct the assumptions piling up around me. To everyone watching, I probably looked resigned, accepting, defeated, but resignation wasn't what I felt. What I felt was patience. Because I had learned something over the years they hadn't. The loudest rooms are often the least prepared for the truth when it finally arrives. And the people most confident in their judgments are the ones most shaken when those judgments collapse. At that moment, none of them knew how fragile their certainty was. None of them realized that the story they had constructed about me, layer by layer, laugh by laugh, was missing critical information. Information that didn't need my voice to be revealed. As the crowd settled into place for the next part of the evening, I caught sight of the entrance doors opening briefly, then closing again. I didn't think anything of it at first. Guests came and went all night. But something in the shift of the room, the subtle pause, the slight reorientation of attention made me look up. I didn't recognize the person who had just arrived. No one had announced them. No one rushed to greet them loudly. But conversations softened. Laughter dipped. And instinctively, people made space. I didn't know why yet. All I knew was that for the first time that night, the room's attention was moving away from the people who had been mocking me and toward someone who had just walked in quietly, carrying a presence that didn't need to explain itself. At first, no one openly acknowledged the shift. It happened subtly, the way weather changes before a storm felt more than seen. Conversations near the entrance softened, voices lowering as people glanced over shoulders a little too often. Laughter that had been easy minutes earlier now sounded delayed, forced to restart after brief interruptions. The confidence in the room didn't disappear, but it wavered as if something unfamiliar had entered the equation. I noticed it because I had nothing else to focus on. The person who had just arrived stood near the doorway, not searching for attention, not greeting anyone loudly. They didn't look lost, and they didn't look impressed. They took in the room with a calm, deliberate glance, as if measuring something only they could see. Their posture was relaxed but precise, the kind that comes from long habit rather than effort. People around them began adjusting without realizing it. Jackets straightened, phones slipped back into pockets. A few guests leaned in to whisper, trying to identify who the newcomer might be. I didn't recognize them, but I recognized the reaction. That kind of reaction only happens when authority enters a room unannounced. Still, the mockery didn't stop right away. Old habits die hard, especially when people believe they're safe. As guests settled back into their conversations, someone near me let out a quiet laugh and said, "I swear every family has one like that." I didn't need to ask who they meant. Their eyes flicked toward me for half a second before returning to their drink. Another voice added, "At least they know how to stay in their lane." This time the words were sharper, less disguised. I felt the familiar tightening again, but I didn't move. I didn't look away. I simply stood there, breathing slowly, counting the seconds between comments like I always did. Silence had become my way of staying intact. My sibling was nearby, laughing along with a group of guests. Their fiancé nodded, smiling politely, enjoying the ease of belonging. No one corrected the tone. No one suggested that the conversation had gone too far. Why would they? To them it hadn't. Someone finally addressed me directly again. "So," a man said, swirling his drink thoughtfully, "do you ever wish you'd aimed higher?" It was framed as curiosity. It always was. I met his eyes calmly. "I aim where I need to." He chuckled, unconvinced. "Fair enough," he said, the way people do when they've already dismissed the answer. The conversation drifted on without me. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't the individual comments. It was the collective agreement behind them. The way everyone seemed aligned on who I was allowed to be and how small that space was. Across the room, my parents were deep in conversation with the fiancé's family. I watched my mother laugh at something. I couldn't hear her hand resting lightly on her glass. My father nodded along, content. They looked comfortable, secure, as if nothing in this room conflicted with how they understood the world. I wondered if they noticed how often I was being referenced without being respected. If they heard the words that landed like small cuts, or if to them this was simply how things were supposed to be. I didn't interrupt them to find out. As the evening continued, the tone sharpened further. Alcohol made people bolder, and boldness made honesty careless. A woman I'd never met leaned toward my sibling and said loud enough for several of us to hear, "It must be such a relief knowing you're the successful one." My sibling laughed, not unkindly, but without denying it. "We all find our paths," they replied. "Some just travel farther." The implication was clear. I felt eyes slide toward me again. Some curious, some amused, none apologetic. I could have spoken up then. I could have corrected the narrative. I could have listed credentials, accomplishments, figures. I could have defended myself. But I didn't. Because I knew something they didn't. Defending yourself in a room that enjoys misunderstanding you only gives them more material to twist. And because deep down I sensed that the night hadn't reached its final act yet. Near the entrance, the stranger remained. They had moved only slightly now, standing closer to the wall, observing. A server passed by them and paused, speaking quietly. The stranger nodded once, thanked them, and continued watching the room with the same calm attention. People noticed. Whispers spread. Questions formed behind polite smiles. "Do you know who that is?" someone murmured. "No, but they look important." "I think they're with the venue." "No, not dressed like staff." Speculation buzzed quietly, distracting the room just enough that the jokes aimed at me slowed. Not stopped, but softened. Attention had found a new uncertainty. As speeches were about to begin, the host tapped a glass to gather everyone. Guests moved toward the center of the room, forming a loose semicircle. I ended up near the back, where I was least likely to be noticed, and most able to leave, if I needed to. The stranger moved too, positioning themselves slightly off to the side. Close enough to hear everything. Close enough to be seen. The first speech was warm, predictable. Praise for the couple. Stories about ambition, partnership, bright futures. Applause followed at all the right moments. My sibling beamed. Their fiancé squeezed their hand. Then came the informal remarks, the unscripted part of the evening where people felt free to speak more casually. Someone joked about carrying the family name forward. Another referenced finally marrying into success. Each comment drew laughter, reinforcing the same hierarchy that had defined the night. And then, inevitably, someone gestured vaguely in my direction. Well, they said with a grin, not everyone can be extraordinary. The room laughed again. This time the laughter was cut short, not by a shout, not by an interruption, by silence. It spread slowly, starting near the entrance, moving inward as people noticed that someone wasn't laughing. That someone was watching the speaker with an expression that hadn't changed but now carried weight. The stranger took one step forward, not enough to command the room, just enough to signal intention. The speaker faltered words trailing off awkwardly. A few guests glanced between them and the stranger uncertain. I felt it then, the moment before something irreversible happens. No one had addressed me yet. No one had defended me. And I hadn't said a word. But the assumptions that had been made so freely all night were about to meet someone who didn't share them. And whatever was about to happen, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I wouldn't need to speak at all. The silence didn't break immediately. It lingered thick and unfamiliar, as if the room itself was unsure how to proceed. The speaker who had made the joke shifted their weight, forcing a small laugh that went unanswered. A few people glanced down at their glasses. Others looked toward the stranger, trying to decide whether they were imagining the tension or if something had truly changed. I felt it in my chest, a quiet stillness different from the earlier discomfort. This wasn't the tightness of being mocked. This was anticipation. The stranger didn't raise their voice. They didn't interrupt the event or demand attention. They simply stood there, hands relaxed at their sides, eyes steady. When they spoke, it was directed not at the speaker but at the host. "Excuse me," they said calmly, their voice carrying just far enough. "Before we continue, may I ask a quick question?" The host blinked, caught off guard. Of course, they replied too quickly. "Go ahead." The stranger nodded once, then turned slightly, scanning the group. "I'm looking for someone," they said. "I was told they'd be here tonight." A few guests exchanged glances. My sibling's fiancé stepped forward, eager to be helpful. "Who are you looking for?" they asked with a polite smile. The stranger's eyes moved slowly, deliberately, until they met mine. "Are you?" they asked, speaking clearly now. "The one named Alex." The room shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me at once, the collective focus landing so suddenly it was almost physical. For a moment, I didn't respond. Not because I was confused, but because I wanted to be certain I had heard correctly. "Yes," I said finally. "That's me." The stranger smiled just slightly. "Thank you," they said. "I'm glad I found you." A murmur rippled through the guests. Questions formed, instantly visible in raised eyebrows and tightened expressions. People looked from me to the stranger and back again, recalibrating something they hadn't realized needed adjusting. My sibling frowned, confusion crossing their face. "Do you know each other?" they asked. The stranger nodded. "Professionally," they replied. "We've worked together." The word "worked" landed differently now. It carried weight. Someone near the front cleared their throat. "And you are?" they asked, unable to contain their curiosity. The stranger turned slightly, addressing the room without posturing. "My name is Daniel Harris," they said. "I'm a senior counsel with the state." That was all they said. They didn't list credentials. They didn't explain their presence. They didn't need to. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped entirely. Smiles froze. I saw the exact moment recognition registered on a few faces, those who understood what that title meant. Others followed their lead, sensing that this wasn't a name or role you laughed over casually. My sibling's fiancé stiffened. "Senior counsel? As in?" they began. Daniel nodded. "As in legal oversight and compliance," he said evenly. "Which is why I was surprised to hear certain comments tonight." The air in the room felt heavier, now charged with awareness. "I wasn't planning to speak," Daniel continued, still calm. "But when I heard someone suggest that not everyone here was extraordinary, I felt it necessary to clarify something." He turned toward the speaker who had made the joke earlier. The man looked suddenly very aware of his surroundings. "Alex here," Daniel said, gesturing toward me without exaggeration, "has been part of multiple federal-level reviews over the past several years. Quietly, effectively. Their work has helped prevent serious legal exposure for organizations you've probably heard of." A few gasps escaped before people could stop themselves. I remained still, hands loosely clasped in front of me. My heart was pounding, but my face stayed neutral. This wasn't triumph, it was revelation, Daniel continued. They don't advertise their role because confidentiality is central to it. But make no mistake, when decisions involving millions of dollars and significant legal risk need to be handled without spectacle, Alex is one of the people professionals trust. The word trust echoed. Someone near my parents whispered something urgently. My mother's smile had faded completely. My father looked stunned, as if reassembling years of assumptions in real time. My sibling opened their mouth, then closed it again. Daniel let the silence work for him. He didn't rush to fill it. He waited until the room was fully aware that something fundamental had shifted. I came tonight, he said, because Alex was kind enough to advise on a matter that affected my office. I wanted to thank them in person. He turned to me then, his tone softening. I appreciate your discretion, Alex. As always. I nodded. Of course. The simplicity of the exchange seemed to unsettle people even more than the information itself. Someone finally spoke. I didn't realize, the earlier speaker said weakly. Daniel met their gaze calmly. That's the thing about assumptions, he replied. They're comfortable until they're wrong. No one laughed. The host shifted awkwardly. Well, they said, forcing a smile, this is unexpected. Daniel nodded. Life often is. I felt dozens of eyes on me, searching for a reaction, an expression of vindication, a smirk, something. I gave them nothing, because the truth didn't need my embellishment. My siblings stepped closer, their voice low. Why didn't you ever tell us? They asked. I looked at them for a moment before answering. You never asked, I said quietly. That was all. The weight of that sentence settled between us heavier than any accusation could have been. Daniel glanced at his watch. I won't interrupt your celebration any longer, he said to the room. I just wanted to make sure Alex was acknowledged properly. He turned back to me. If you're free later this week, I'd like to follow up. I am, I replied. He nodded once, then stepped back, giving the room back to itself. But it wasn't the same room anymore. The laughter didn't resume. Conversations restarted cautiously, voices lower, careful. People who had ignored me minutes earlier now found reasons to smile in my direction, to nod, to look suddenly interested. I didn't move toward them. I stayed exactly where I was. Because for the first time that night, I didn't need to prove I belonged. The truth had arrived on its own. After Daniel stepped back, the room tried to recover, but recovery came awkwardly, like a smile forced too soon after bad news. People returned to their conversations, but the rhythm was gone. Words were chosen more carefully now. Laughter, when it appeared, sounded tentative, as if everyone was listening to themselves speak. The hierarchy that had felt so solid earlier was no longer stable. It had cracks, and everyone could see them. I stayed where I was. That alone seemed to confuse people. A woman who had laughed earlier at one of the jokes near me approached with a polite, overbright smile. I had no idea, she said, as if ignorance were an apology. That must be such important work. It is, I replied simply. She nodded too quickly. Well, you should be very proud. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because the conversation felt transactional now. As if respect had suddenly become available for purchase once the right credentials were revealed. She drifted away, unsettled. My parents were slower to approach. They stood across the room for several minutes, watching me as if I were someone new. I recognized the look, careful, searching, unsure how to speak without exposing how much they had misunderstood. Finally, my mother crossed the space between us. Why didn't you tell us? She asked quietly, her voice carrying more confusion than accusation. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a wave of exhaustion that surprised me with its depth. I didn't think it mattered, I said. It never seemed to. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. For once, she had nothing ready. My father joined her, his expression tight. We just didn't realize, he said. I nodded. I know, that was the truth. They hadn't realized, and in some ways that was the problem. My sibling hovered nearby, clearly struggling. When they finally spoke, their voice was strained. You could have said something, they insisted. You could have corrected people. I met their eyes calmly. Why? I asked. So I could be believed only after proving I was worth believing. They looked away. The band began to play softly in the background, a signal that the party was supposed to move on. Guests were encouraged toward the dining area, but the atmosphere remained fractured. People glanced at me as they passed curiosity, replacing the earlier dismissal. I felt none of the satisfaction they probably expected me to feel. Instead, I felt tired. Tired of being reevaluated only when it was convenient. Tired of watching respect appear and disappear based on external validation. Tired of knowing that for many people in that room my value had changed, not because I had changed, but because someone powerful had spoken for me. Daniel caught my eye from across the room and gave a small understanding nod. He didn't approach again. He didn't need to. His presence had already done what needed to be done. As dinner was served, I took a seat at the edge of the table, the same place I would have chosen before. No one suggested I move. No one dared. Conversation resumed in fragments. Someone asked about my work this time directly. I answered briefly, carefully avoiding specifics. Confidentiality hadn't stopped being important just because the room had changed. They listened intently now. That too felt strange. Halfway through the meal, my sibling leaned toward me again. "I'm sorry," they said quietly. The words sounded unfamiliar in their mouth. I nodded. "I know." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. I didn't stay long after that. When the plates were cleared and speeches resumed, I stood. No announcement, no dramatic exit, just a quiet movement that drew a few glances. My mother noticed first. "You're leaving already?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I think so." She hesitated. We didn't get much time to talk. I met her eyes gently. "We will," I said. "Another day." That was true, but it would be on different terms. I made my way toward the exit, feeling lighter with each step. Not triumphant, just unburdened. The assumptions that had weighed on me earlier no longer felt like mine to carry. At the door, I paused briefly and looked back. The room was still beautiful. The decorations still elegant, the celebration still ongoing. But it felt smaller now, less absolute. I realized then that I hadn't been diminished by their mockery. They had diminished themselves by needing it. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. I took a deep breath, letting it settle in my lungs. For the first time that evening, my shoulders relaxed. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't argued or explained. I had stood still, and somehow that had been enough. I didn't go straight home after leaving the venue. I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the quiet undo what the noise had done. The night replayed itself in fragments, laughter that stopped too suddenly, faces rearranging themselves when authority entered the room, my sibling's voice faltering for the first time in years. None of it felt satisfying. It felt clarifying. For a long time I had believed that silence meant acceptance, that by not correcting people I was agreeing with their version of me. That belief had kept me awake more nights than I cared to admit, but that night showed me something different. Silence isn't agreement when it's chosen. Sometimes it's restraint. Sometimes it's confidence that doesn't need witnesses. My phone buzzed while I was still sitting there. A text from my mother. "We need to talk." I didn't answer right away. I drove home slowly, letting the city lights blur past my thoughts, finally unspooling. I thought about all the times I had swallowed comments like the ones I'd heard that night. All the moments I had wondered whether I should speak louder, explain more, make myself easier to understand. And I thought about Daniel, how little he had said, how much had changed because of it. Authority doesn't argue, it clarifies. By the time I got home, my phone had several more messages. My sibling, my father, even an unfamiliar number I recognized from work, likely Daniel, following up. I didn't respond to any of them immediately. I made dinner. Something simple. I ate slowly, tasting my food for the first time all evening. I showered. I changed into comfortable clothes. Only then did I sit down and look at my phone again. The messages followed a pattern. Confusion. Apology. Curiosity. "Why didn't you ever tell us? We didn't know it was that serious. You could have said something sooner." I read them all, then set the phone down. The truth was simple. Even if it was uncomfortable, I hadn't told them because I didn't want my worth to depend on their approval. I hadn't spoken because I wanted to see who they believed me to be without credentials propping me up. That night they had shown me. The next morning my mother called. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was softer than usual. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "I keep thinking about everything." "I figured," I said. There was a pause. "You've been carrying a lot alone, haven't you?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was insightful, but because it was rare. "Yes," I said honestly. She exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We talked for a while, not about the party specifically, but about the years leading up to it, about assumptions that had hardened into habits, about how easy it is to mistake quiet competence for a lack of ambition. She listened more than she spoke. That too was new. Later that day, Daniel called. His tone was the same as always, professional, measured. "I hope I didn't overstep last night," he said. "You didn't," I replied. "Thank you." There was a brief pause. "There's something else," he continued. "We're finalizing a review panel for a public oversight case. Your name came up. I understood what that meant. Visibility, responsibility, a shift." "I'm interested," I said. "Good," he replied. "We'll talk details this week." When I hung up, I realized something had changed, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. I had spent years shrinking my presence to avoid conflict, to keep peace, to make others comfortable. I had believed that being underestimated was the price of staying unbothered. But comfort, I was learning, isn't the same as respect. The engagement party didn't magically fix my family. It didn't turn apologies into understanding overnight. But it did something quieter and more important. It drew a line. A week later, my sibling asked to meet for coffee. We sat across from each other in a small cafe, steam rising from our mugs. They looked nervous, fidgeting with the sleeve of their jacket. "I owe you an apology," they said finally. "Not just for that night. For a lot." I waited. "I think I needed to believe I was better than you," they admitted. "It made me feel safer." I nodded. "I know." They looked up, surprised. "You do?" "Yes," I said. "I just didn't think saying it would change anything." We sat in silence for a moment. "I don't want that to be us anymore," they said quietly. "I don't either," I replied. "But it can't go back to how it was." They nodded. "I understand. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning." In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Work intensified. Meetings grew more public. My name appeared on documents that didn't stay behind closed doors. I didn't advertise it. I didn't need to. At family gatherings, the questions changed. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. People listened when I spoke. They didn't interrupt as often. They didn't assume as freely. And I noticed something else. The jokes stopped. Not because I had become untouchable, but because the room had learned that silence could mean depth, not absence. One evening, months later, I found myself at another gathering. Different venue, different faces. Someone asked what I did. "I work in compliance," I said. They nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds important." "It is," I replied. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain further. Because I had learned something the hard way, and it had stayed with me ever since. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. You don't have to fight every assumption. And you don't have to speak loudly to stand tall. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait until the truth arrives on its own terms. And when it does, it speaks louder than you ever could. The weeks after the engagement party didn't bring dramatic confrontations or instant healing. What they brought instead was something quieter and far more unsettling for the people who had misjudged me. Distance. Not physical distance. Emotional distance. I stopped filling silences for others. I stopped explaining myself in advance. I stopped softening my words to make them easier to accept. And for the first time, I noticed how much effort I had once put into being palatable. At work, the shift Daniel mentioned became real very quickly. The review panel he had referenced wasn't symbolic. It was public-facing, documented, and politically sensitive. There were real stakes, millions of dollars in contracts, reputations tied to outcomes and scrutiny from people who didn't tolerate mistakes. I wasn't the youngest person on the panel, but I was the quietest. And that, I realized, was why I had been asked. The first meeting took place in a government building downtown. Glass conference room, long table, nameplates. When I took my seat, no one questioned it. No one asked what I did there. They already knew. Authority, when recognized, doesn't need to announce itself. As discussions unfolded, I spoke only when necessary. I referenced documentation. I asked precise questions. I didn't argue emotionally. I didn't defend opinions. I presented facts. By the end of the session, people were turning toward me before making decisions, waiting for my assessment. I felt grounded, centered, not elevated, just properly placed. Meanwhile, my family struggled with the recalibration. My parents invited me over for dinner one evening, just the three of us. No extended family, no audience. My mother cooked too much food, as she always did when she was nervous. My father poured wine and didn't touch his glass. Halfway through the meal, my mother spoke. "I keep thinking about how we talked about you over the years," she said carefully. "About what we assumed." I waited. "We thought we were being realistic," she continued. "But I'm starting to see how often we were just dismissive." My father nodded. "We mistook quiet for lack of ambition." "Yes," I said. "You did." There was no anger in my voice, just clarity. My father exhaled slowly. "That's on us." It was the first time I had ever heard him say something like that. I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't say it was fine or that it didn't matter, because it had mattered. For a long time. Instead, I said I didn't need praise. I needed respect. They absorbed that in silence. The next family gathering was different. Not perfect, but different. People were more cautious. Conversations didn't skate over me anymore. When someone asked what I did, they waited for the answer instead of filling in assumptions. No one joked at my expense. No one tried to elevate themselves by lowering me. And still, I noticed something important. The change wasn't universal. A few relatives remained distant. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others were polite but stiff, as if my presence unsettled the version of reality they preferred. I didn't chase them. I had learned that discomfort is often the price of correction. One afternoon, my sibling called unexpectedly. "I ran into someone from the party," they said. "They asked about you." I said nothing. "They were different," my sibling continued. "Careful, almost intimidated." I closed my eyes briefly. And it made me realize something they said. I liked being the one everyone admired. And I didn't notice how often that came at your expense. I appreciated the honesty. It didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. "I'm not asking to be admired," I said. "I just don't want to be diminished." "I know," they replied. Silence followed, not awkward, just reflective. That silence told me more than words could have. At work, the panel's findings were released publicly. My name appeared among others listed without fanfare. No interviews, no spotlight. Just acknowledgement. And that was enough. One evening, weeks later, I received an email from someone I didn't recognize. They had been at the engagement party. "I owe you an apology," the message began. "I spoke carelessly that night. I didn't know who you were, but more importantly, I didn't bother to find out. I read it twice, then archived it. Apologies matter, but they don't require response. What mattered more was how I felt walking through the world now. I noticed I stood straighter, not because I felt superior, but because I felt aligned. My silence no longer felt like retreat. It felt like choice. I thought back to the moment Daniel had spoken my name in that room, how quickly power had rearranged perception, how fragile the hierarchy had been once challenged. That realization stayed with me. People often confuse visibility with value. They assume the loudest voice carries the most weight. They believe recognition creates worth. But worth exists long before it's recognized. The engagement party hadn't changed who I was. It had changed who others thought I was allowed to be. And that distinction made all the difference. Months later, I attended another professional event, larger, more formal. As I entered, someone greeted me by name. Another asked for my opinion. A third waited respectfully while I finished a conversation. No one mocked, no one minimized, no one needed convincing. Not because I demanded it, because consistency had earned it. That night, driving home, I thought about the version of myself who had stood at the edge of that engagement party, holding a glass of water, absorbing quiet ridicule without reacting. That person hadn't been weak. They had been patient. And patience, I had learned, is often mistaken for powerlessness until the moment it proves otherwise. The public nature of the review panel changed more than my schedule. It changed how people spoke to me when they believed their words might carry consequences. Emails became more measured. Meetings became more deliberate. People asked questions they had previously assumed they already knew the answers to. I didn't enjoy the shift, but I respected it. It meant the work mattered enough to demand care. What surprised me most was how quickly authority reshaped memory. At a professional conference a few months later, I ran into someone who had been at the engagement party. They greeted me, warmly speaking, as if we'd always shared mutual respect. They referenced my work casually, as though it had always been common knowledge. I didn't correct them. Not because I was bitter, but because I understood something now. People often rewrite the past to protect their present selves. Confronting that rarely leads to growth. Letting it sit sometimes does. The real test came when the oversight case reached its most sensitive phase. A public hearing was scheduled. Media interest was growing. The room would be full, lawmakers, executives, press. This was the kind of environment where posturing was common and humility rare. Before the hearing, Daniel called me into his office. "This is where it gets uncomfortable," he said plainly. "There will be pressure. Attempts to redirect blame. Some people will try to minimize your role." I nodded. "They always do." He studied me for a moment. "You don't seem worried." "I'm not," I said. "I've been underestimated my entire life. I know how to function there." The hearing took place in a large chamber with rows of seats and microphones positioned like silent witnesses. When I took my place at the table, cameras clicked. Names were read aloud. My title followed mine, neutral, factual, undeniable. As testimony unfolded, patterns emerged. Evasions, carefully worded half-answers. I waited, listened, took notes. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I referenced timelines, documents, figures. I asked one question that cut through an entire narrative that had been carefully constructed to deflect responsibility. The room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Later, a reporter approached me outside the chamber. "Do you think your findings will change how accountability is enforced moving forward?" they asked. I considered the question. "I think accountability has always been there," I replied. "It just requires patience to reveal." The quote made it into the article. That evening, my phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, from acquaintances, from family. My sibling texted, "I watched the hearing. You were incredible." I stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "Thank you." It felt different now, less charged, more honest. A week later, my parents attended another family event, a birthday low-key, nothing extravagant. When someone began to make a dismissive comment about people who stay behind the scenes, my father interrupted. "That's not true," he said firmly. "Some of the most important work happens quietly." The room fell silent. I hadn't been there to hear it, but when he told me later, his voice carried something new. Conviction. That mattered more than applause ever could have. Not everyone adjusted so smoothly. One relative continued to make subtle remarks, trying to reclaim the old dynamic. Jokes framed as nostalgia. Comments about how I had finally come into my own, as if my value had only recently begun. I let them pass. Correction doesn't always need confrontation. Sometimes it just needs consistency. Over time, the distance between who I was and who they thought I was became too wide to ignore. They stopped trying to compress it. I noticed changes in myself too. I no longer rehearsed explanations in my head before gatherings. I no longer scanned rooms for exits. I no longer felt the need to brace myself against ridicule. Not because I was immune, but because I was grounded. One afternoon I met Daniel for coffee. He watched me quietly for a moment before speaking. "You've changed," he said. "I think I've stopped shrinking," I replied. He smiled. "Good. The work requires that." As we talked, I realized something else. The engagement party hadn't been the beginning of my recognition. It had been the end of my invisibility. Those are not the same thing. Recognition depends on others. Visibility depends on circumstance. But invisibility, true invisibility, is a condition imposed when others decide you don't matter. That night it had been lifted. Not because I demanded it, but because someone with authority recognized truth when they saw it and refused to let it be dismissed. I thought back to the laughter, the casual mockery, the ease with which people had reduced me. None of it haunted me anymore. It felt distant, like a story I had once lived but no longer inhabited. The final report was released publicly shortly after. Its findings were clear. Consequences followed. Some careers stalled, others ended. I wasn't asked to comment on any of it. That suited me. Power doesn't need to narrate itself. At a quiet dinner weeks later, my sibling asked, "Do you ever wish you'd spoken up sooner?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "If I had, they would have heard my voice, but not the truth." They nodded slowly. That answer stayed with me. Because the truth is, this speaking isn't always the strongest response. Silence, when grounded in reality and supported by action, can be unassailable. The engagement party had tried to define me in a single night. Instead, it had revealed something much larger about how easily people confuse noise with substance, and how unprepared they are when substance finally speaks. And when it did speak, it didn't shout. It didn't need to. By the time the final report was released, the story had stopped being about me, at least on the surface. Headlines focused on accountability, oversight failures, corrective measures. Names of institutions were printed in bold, statements were issued, committees promised reform. The machinery of consequence moved forward, slow but deliberate. My role remained largely invisible to the public exactly as it should have been. But invisibility no longer meant insignificance. Inside professional circles, the shift was unmistakable. People who once spoke over me now waited. People who once tested boundaries now respected them. Invitations arrived without qualifiers. My input was requested early, not as an afterthought. What surprised me most was how uncomfortable this made some people. At a post-hearing reception, quiet, professional, carefully curated, I noticed a familiar face from the engagement party standing across the room. The same man who had joked about boring work. The same smile now strained. He approached cautiously. "Alex," he said, extending his hand. "I've been meaning to say, I misjudged you." I shook his hand briefly. "That happens," I replied. He hesitated, clearly expecting more. "An opening. Forgiveness. Validation. I guess you never know what people are really doing," he added. "No," I said evenly. "You don't." The conversation ended there. I wasn't withholding grace. I simply wasn't interested in rewriting the past to make anyone feel better about it. At home, the changes were subtler but deeper. My parents began asking questions they had never asked before. Not performative ones. Real ones. About my work. About how decisions were made. About the cost of carrying responsibility quietly. One evening, my father admitted something I hadn't expected. "I think I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that if your path didn't look impressive, it meant I had failed you somehow. So I minimized it instead." I listened. "That wasn't fair," he continued. "To you or to me?" "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." There was no accusation in my voice. No need for one. Healing doesn't require drama. It requires honesty sustained over time. My siblings struggled the most. They had built an identity around being exceptional, the one others pointed to the one who brought pride into rooms. When that narrative was interrupted even briefly, it shook them. We met again weeks later, walking through a park near my apartment. Leaves had started to turn. The air was cool, grounding. "I don't know who I am without comparison," they admitted suddenly. I stopped walking. "That's not something I can fix for you," I said gently, "but I won't be part of the comparison anymore." They nodded, eyes downcast. "I know. That was the boundary." Professionally, another turning point arrived when I was asked to testify again, this time in a closed session. No cameras, no press, just decision-makers and documents. At one point, a senior executive attempted to deflect responsibility with a familiar tactic, praising my thoroughness while subtly suggesting I might be overcautious. I let him finish. Then I slid a document across the table. "This timeline contradicts your statement," I said calmly. "Here, here, and here." The room went still. No one laughed. No one minimized. The executive cleared his throat and adjusted his position. "I see," he said. "Power recognizes precision." After the session, Daniel pulled me aside. "You could have embarrassed him publicly," he said. "You chose not to." "I wasn't there to embarrass anyone," I replied. "I was there to be accurate." He smiled. "That's why you're trusted." Trust had become my currency, not admiration, not visibility. Months passed. Life normalized in its new shape. At a family holiday dinner, someone new, a distant cousin's partner, asked what I did. The table fell quiet for a moment, waiting. "I work in compliance and oversight," I said. They nodded. "That sounds intense." "It can be," I replied. No one laughed. No one clarified. No one diminished. Conversation moved on. Later, as dishes were cleared, my mother caught my eye. She smiled, not proudly, not apologetically, just warmly. That was enough. The memory of the engagement party returned occasionally, not as pain but as reference. A reminder of how quickly rooms decide who you are and how wrong they can be. I realized something important during that time. Justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives with recalibration. With quiet corrections that change how people move, speak, and think around you. And sometimes justice is simply no longer needing it. One evening, I received an invitation to another celebration, this time a professional milestone for someone else. I attended without hesitation. Standing in that room, listening to speeches, I felt no urge to position myself at the edge. I stood where it made sense. I spoke when spoken to. I listened when it mattered. Someone nearby made an offhand comment about the quiet ones. They caught themselves mid-sentence and rephrased. I noticed, not with satisfaction but with clarity. The world hadn't become kinder overnight. It had become more precise. That precision was earned. When I left that night, I thought again of the stranger who had spoken my name first, of how little he had needed to say, of how authority, when grounded in truth, doesn't demand attention, it commands respect. I had learned to carry that lesson with me, not loudly, not performatively, but consistently. The final turning point didn't come in a courtroom or a conference room. It came quietly in a place where I had once felt the smallest. My sibling invited me to their home for dinner, a modest place, carefully decorated, chosen more for image than comfort. It was the first time they had asked me over alone since the engagement party. No parents, no extended family, just the two of us. I arrived on time. They answered the door looking nervous, a detail I would have missed before. Dinner was fine, ordinary. We talked about neutral things, at first work schedules, traffic weather. The careful distance remained, like both of us were testing whether the ground would hold. Halfway through the meal, they put their fork down. I need to say something, they said. I waited. I've been thinking a lot about that night, they continued. About how easily I let people laugh at you. About how I benefited from it. They didn't rush. They didn't soften the words. For years they said I needed you to be smaller so I could feel bigger. And when you stayed quiet, I told myself you didn't mind. I nodded slowly. I minded, I said. I just didn't argue. They swallowed. I know. I see that now. Silence filled the space between us, not strained, not defensive, just honest. I don't expect forgiveness, they added. I just don't want to pretend anymore. That mattered. I leaned back slightly. I don't need you to feel guilty, I said. I need you to stop competing with me in your head. They looked at me, eyes tired. I don't know how. You'll learn, I said. Or you won't. But I won't participate. That was the boundary in its clearest form. Later that week, something else happened, something public. The oversight case that had started everything reached its final stage. A press conference was held. Statements were read. Questions were answered. One reporter asked Daniel a question about internal accountability. He paused, then said, "This process worked because people who don't seek attention were allowed to do their jobs." The camera panned briefly across the panel. My name was mentioned once. No emphasis, no explanation. And yet that single acknowledgement landed harder than any praise I had ever received. Afterward, as people filtered out, a junior staffer approached me. Nervous. Earnest. I just wanted to say they began watching you through this. It helped me. I'm not loud either. I always thought that meant I'd never matter. I met their eyes. You matter if your work does, I said. The rest catches up later. They nodded, visibly steadied. That was when I understood something I hadn't before. My silence hadn't just protected me. It had created space for others who thought they didn't belong. The final reconciliation came unexpectedly. At another family gathering, smaller, quieter, my father stood up mid-conversation and addressed the room. I want to say something, he said. Everyone looked at him surprised. I spent a long time praising the wrong things, he continued, and ignoring the right ones because they were quiet. His voice didn't shake. That stops now. He turned toward me. I'm proud of you. The room was silent. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt complete. Not because the words were spoken, but because I no longer needed them to be. As the evening wound down, my mother hugged me tightly. Not apologetically, not performatively, just fully. You always stood on your own, she whispered. We just didn't notice. I smiled gently. I know. When I left that night, I realized the story had reached its true conclusion, not with exposure or embarrassment, but with alignment. The people who mattered had adjusted. The people who couldn't had faded into irrelevance. And I had stayed exactly who I was the entire time. Justice hadn't arrived as punishment. It had arrived as clarity. And clarity once seen can't be unseen. Time didn't rush to close the chapter. It slowed almost deliberately, as if allowing everything to settle into its proper place. Life, after the hearings, after the family shifts, after the quiet acknowledgments, felt strangely calm. Not empty, just steady. The kind of steadiness I had been building toward without realizing it. My work continued, demanding as ever. New cases, new reviews, new rooms where decisions were made behind closed doors. I walked into those rooms without hesitation now. Not because I felt powerful, but because I no longer felt uncertain. Uncertainty had been the weight I carried for years. Not about my abilities, but about my place. About whether being quiet meant being lesser. About whether dignity required defense. That question had finally been answered. One afternoon, I was asked to attend a public forum at a university, an event meant to discuss ethics, accountability, and governance. I wasn't the keynote speaker. I wasn't even introduced prominently. I was there as a panelist, one among many. Students filled the auditorium. Young, attentive, restless in the way people are when they're still deciding who they're allowed to become. During the Q&A, a student raised their hand. "What do you do?" they asked carefully, "when you're the only one in the room who sees a problem, but no one seems to take you seriously?" The question wasn't theoretical. I could hear it in their voice. I took a moment before answering. "You don't convince them all at once," I said. "You document. You prepare. You make sure that when the moment comes, the truth doesn't rely on your volume to survive." The room was silent. Being underestimated, I continued, is painful. But it also teaches you precision. And precision lasts longer than noise. After the forum, several students approached me. They didn't ask for titles or accolades. They asked how to endure being overlooked without becoming bitter. I told them the truth. "You don't endure it forever," I said. "You endure it until it's no longer necessary." That night, driving home, I thought again of the engagement party, the glass of water in my hand, the laughter that stopped short the stranger who spoke my name. That moment had felt accidental at the time, like a twist of fate. Now I understood it differently. It wasn't an interruption. It was an alignment. Authority hadn't created my value that night. It had revealed it to a room that wasn't ready to see it on its own. And once revealed, it couldn't be taken back. My relationship with my family remained changed but healthier. We spoke less often, but more honestly. There were no more competitions disguised as conversations. No more comparisons hiding inside jokes. When we were together, it was on equal ground. My sibling no longer introduced me with qualifiers. They didn't need to. We had learned how to exist side by side without measuring distance. Months later, I received another invitation, this time to a different engagement party. A colleague celebration. Different city. Different people. As I stood in that room, drink in hand, I noticed someone standing quietly near the edge. Observing. Listening. Almost invisible. For a moment, I saw myself. People laughed nearby. Conversations overlapped. Status floated just beneath the surface, unspoken but present. I considered leaving them alone. Silence, after all, had been my refuge. But then I remembered something else. Silence protects, but recognition empowers. I walked over. "Hi," I said gently. "I don't think we've met." Their eyes widened slightly. "Oh no, I'm just here with a friend," I smiled. "Well, I'm glad you're here." Nothing dramatic followed. No revelation. No authority figure stepping in. Just a moment of inclusion. And that, I realized, was the final lesson. Justice isn't always about being seen. Sometimes it's about seeing others before the room decides who they are. When I left that party, the night felt familiar but no longer heavy. I carried myself easily, without armor, without apology. I had learned that standing tall doesn't require confrontation. It requires truth, patience, and the courage to let time do its work. The people who mocked me that night at the engagement party still existed somewhere. Some had learned, some hadn't. But none of them defined me anymore. Because in the end, the person who had been underestimated, ignored, and quietly dismissed had never disappeared. They had simply been waiting. Waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be mistaken for weakness. Waiting for the moment when the truth would speak without shouting. And when it finally did, I was already standing. If there's one lesson this story leaves behind, it's this: your value does not begin when others finally recognize it. It exists long before the room decides to notice. Many of us spend years trying to explain ourselves to people who have already made up their minds. We raise our voices, list our sacrifices, defend our choices, hoping that clarity will earn us respect. But real life teaches a quieter truth. Some people only understand you when evidence speaks, not emotion. And that doesn't mean you were wrong to stay silent. It means you were strong enough to wait. Being underestimated hurts. It creates loneliness, doubt, and moments where you question your own worth. But it also builds something rare: depth. It teaches you patience. It sharpens your integrity. And it prepares you for the day when the truth doesn't need your permission to surface. When that day comes, justice doesn't always feel loud or triumphant. Often it feels calm, clean, final. like standing tall without saying a word because you no longer need to. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated, only to be proven right later? What did silence teach you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading them may need your story more than you realize. And if you're drawn to stories about quiet strength, delayed justice, and emotional healing, consider subscribing to the channel. You're not late. You're not invisible. You're exactly where you need to be.